nationwide. So I'd invite all of you to welcome me in welcoming Secretary Anthony Fox. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here in such august company among people whose responsibilities are so great. And we'll go into this a little bit over the next few minutes, but America is a growing country. Places that are very popular to live, have good weather, no personal income taxes, increasingly become attractive. And I don't have to tell you that the challenges of integrating large numbers of people into tighter and tighter spaces creates an awesome, awesome responsibility. And, I'm lucky, thanks for the great introduction, but I'm very lucky that when I was a young city council person in Charlotte, North Carolina, I had the benefit of some visionary transportation planners and professionals on my staff who really taught me to think about transportation beyond just the immediate. And I want to say to all of you who are either staff folks at a MPO level or a city level that I understand and appreciate and highly respect the work that you do, because you really are the wind beneath the wings of us who've served in elected office. So let me just say to you, congratulations, thank you for what you do, and hopefully in the next 45 minutes or so, I can give you a bit of a thumbnail for how I see the emergence of a connected city. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of some people like to go to the end of the book first, so I'm going to give you a little teaser as to what the bottom line here is. The bottom line is there is no technology that's ever been invented that will replace the need for human beings to focus on human beings first. And so there's no algorithm that can push us beyond the unavoidable questions of humanity or the existential questions we face in this country now, probably more than any time in my lifetime, about how do we all live together, whether we're rich or poor, our ethnicity, our national origin. These questions impact how transportation fits into our lives. So let's start on a journey. The next slide here. All right. What does this have to do with transportation? I know you're asking me that question. So I'm standing on the pitcher's mound in Yankee Stadium. I know this is Marlins country, but just bear with me for a minute. I'm standing on the pitcher's mound in Yankee Stadium thinking about why the stadium is placed where it's placed and the direction it's placed in, thinking about how that fits into the context of transportation in general. And the truth is that there is no road, no rail, no highway, no airport, nothing that hasn't been placed exactly where the designers believed would be the best place. So let me get back to baseball for a second and I'll come back. Let's go to the next. So back to me. Go next slide. Okay, in baseball, there is actually a rule. Rule 1.04 that says that essentially home base is to be pointed in a certain direction. Any guesses as to why? The sun. You don't want the sunlight to hit the batter's eyes. And so we go to ballparks thinking that perhaps the direction of the field is placed in a random direction, but it isn't. And I use this as an example because actually there's no infrastructure that's randomly placed anywhere. It's all the product of design, and there's a reason why it is the way it is. Next. So let's go through the history of the highway system for a bit. This is Thomas McDonald. He was really the first director of the Bureau of Highways and actually the one who was tapped by Eisenhower to help design the interstate. I'm sorry, this is President Eisenhower, my problem. Sorry. He had a big idea, and the big idea was to connect farmers to their marketplaces. And in fact, the highway system has been a marvelous economic success. It has accomplished what it was intended to do, but let's be clear that the impact on urban communities was severe. And I would say in retrospect, the case has been at least a little mixed. Even in real time, people were not overwhelmed with glee over the highway system. There were actually protests in many communities over the direction of the highways because there were people who were displaced. And there was change to the urban landscape that occurred, so much so that if you go to Seattle, Washington today, they're now taking down the aqueduct and really putting in place a tunnel that will allow the vista around the city of Seattle towards the ocean to be much more prominent. But to say that this had no impact on the urban environment would be a mistake. There was displacement and there was an impact to the design. Next slide. There is Thomas McDonald. So his goal, as he said, was to get farmers out of the mud. And that was not an insignificant goal. In rural parts of the country, there were certainly challenges with getting folks from the regions into the urban marketplaces. But it was also true that there was not a great deal of regard for the urban environment, as you can see through this quotation. Next slide. And then this is my buddy, Robert Moses. Robert Moses, I have to say, he did some good things. When you go to a play at Lincoln Center, it's hard to not acknowledge his foresight around urban design, but it's also hard not to go on the Bronx-Queens Expressway and not have a great deal of disregard for his vision of urban design. There is an area of Baltimore where the city is literally bisected by a freeway that actually stops cold. It's called the Freeway to Nowhere. And that was done in part to follow a slum clearance strategy, even though the highway today doesn't actually go anywhere. So once again, we've made mistakes. This is personal to me. This is the home that I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was raised there by my grandparents. There's a very embarrassing picture of me in a hat. But when I look at the neighborhood I grew up in, it was actually constrained by these very freeways that I'm talking about. Next slide. In Charlotte, in the 1960s, there was an effort to build urban freeways. I-77 and I-85 actually meet just about 2 blocks away from where I grew up. And so my neighborhood was actually physically constrained by these 2 freeways. So when I looked out front of my grandparents' house, I saw a freeway. When I looked to the right, I saw a freeway. And that was the world I knew. In fact, I didn't know of other neighborhoods in our city because we really just spent so much time in that one place, like so many people do. Next slide. There's a larger story in Charlotte, though, which was that as these freeways were being developed, there were neighborhoods that were torn apart. This is a picture of a neighborhood called Brooklyn. It was a highly African-American neighborhood. There were 1,200 or so African-American owned businesses, and there was schools. As the slum clearance strategy of the Housing and Urban Development Agency started to take hold, and that had connectivity to the highway development system, neighborhoods like this were under assault. And I would also say that in the 1950s and 1960s, there was really no remuneration plan. So the property value that people got for their homes was at the reduced rate based on the fact that the property was going to be torn up anyway. And so you had places like the Charlotte Observer look at this urban core as something to be eliminated. And so when you look at photos, and by the way, this isn't just Charlotte, we'll show you some examples of other places where this was done. Getting back to my Yankee Stadium analogy, the point being that the evolution of the story I'm telling you was the product of design. It was not the product of benign neglect or people not being focused on it. This was actually part of an intent. So in my city, this area was essentially eliminated. A lot of the property was then converted to public use. There were a few churches that acquired some land there, but most of it was used to create a circumferential freeway, I-277. And this is one of the more poignant pictures of people seeing the neighborhood that they used to call home literally destroyed. Next slide. So let's look at the way Charlotte developed. This is the urban freeway system. 1950s, we're going to come on up to present times. And what you will see is a steady march towards ingress and egress from the core of the city and the circumferential route today, which is the Outer Beltway. So in 1960, if you looked at where these freeways were being built, the blue is really where the more affluent population is, the red is where the less affluent population is. This is 1960s. So let's flip it and look into more contemporary times. Next slide. Is almost in complete reverse. Now the lower income populations are hugging the freeways, and the higher populations are elsewhere. That is a story that you'll see in community after community after community. Next. There is a larger story, as I said. Charlotte wasn't the only place. When you look at household displacement, this is the story that we found at USDOT. And if you look at the impact on minority communities, it is unbelievable. Significant impacts to low-income and minority communities and families, and the ability to carry wealth forward. Next. Here in Miami, Overtown, it's bisected by a freeway. Next slide. Staten Island Expressway, same thing. This is a national call-out. Next. St. Paul, where the mayor recently apologized for the bisecting of that community through its lower income and minority populations. Next. New Orleans, I-10. Next. Los Angeles. Next. I-5 in Seattle, we just talked about. There are even some rural examples. Next. In Iowa, where the same thing happened. In this case, farmers who've been displaced from certain parts of their property to make room for the freeways. Next. Montgomery, Alabama. We can go to the next slide. Airports are a different story, but there's also a very similar story. It's interesting, I pull up St. Louis because St. Louis is an interesting case. In St. Louis, there was a neighborhood in St. Louis that abutted what's now the International Airport. And that community was high, low-income, high African-American population. Let's go to the next slide. Stop there. There's That community was displaced to create room for the airport. Sorry, our slides are moving faster than me. That group of people moved to a place called Ferguson, where you saw so many of the incidents in recent years. What you just have seen are pictures of Atlanta. Now we're talking about streets. And I could remember several streets like this when I was growing up in Charlotte, and you can probably imagine them where you are. These streets don't really exist for the people who need to use them on foot or by bicycle, and you see so many times people trying to make do, these paths being cut by the usage of bicycle traffic to avoid the automobile. Next. So I want to ask you to imagine, let's say you're a single mom, you have 3 children, you just spent 2 hours at the grocery store, an hour taking a bus to get from the grocery store to home. You get dropped off at the bus stop, and the house that you live in is 90 feet across the street, and the nearest crossing area is more than half a mile down the road. How many people would walk a half a mile to the crossing area? I'm not going to ask you, never mind. Well, this mom carried her kids across the street. The youngest child, who was about 3 years old, loses his mother's hand and is struck by a car and killed in Atlanta. And in fact, when we look at the city of Atlanta, and I dare say many communities across the country, next slide, we'll see that the concentration of pedestrian and cyclist fatalities is heavily concentrated in lower income areas. And actually, when we looked at this at USDOT, we found that fewer than half of low-income communities have adequate sidewalk assets. And so it's not a surprise that those communities are going to be more affected by pedestrian and bicycle fatalities and accidents. Next. So let me give you a quick thumbnail of U.S. transportation. I tried to do channel my inner Tom Friedman with bumpy, crowded, and late to describe U.S. transportation. I'm going to talk about really 5 issues, and equity will be one of those that I focus on. But let me just start big picture here. Personal mobility, which is the thing that most of us think about when we think about transportation. How am I going to get to the soccer match? How am I going to get to work or school? Personal mobility is changing. It's changing organically because people are recognizing that the personal automobile has its limitations. We spend the second highest amount of our wallet as a country on transportation. And yet, the cars that we buy are used about 5 to 6% of the time. And so people are increasingly making choices about how to buy the trip without necessarily buying the car itself. And whether that's transit or bicycle or scooter or rideshare, those are choices that people are starting to rationalize. There's also another challenge that I think we're starting to recognize, which is, when I was mayor of Charlotte, we had these wonderful suburban areas, which I remember 20 years before, there'd be 80% trees and 5% residential. And then over time, it becomes 70% trees, 15% residential, and by 20 years later, it's 60% residential, 20% trees, et cetera. And all of a sudden, people start to say to themselves, why is there so much traffic? Almost as though the choice that they made 20 years earlier should never be made by someone else. And land use, as many of you know, is so critical to how to make an efficient transportation system work. We decided in Charlotte there were places where we wanted to put the transportation load near arterial roads, roads that could handle greater capacity, and there were places where we didn't want to put intensity. And we started using our zoning ordinances to help us build a more resilient transportation network, which is a tool that many communities lack the courage or the ability to do. This is an interesting slide because what it really points out is as the country urbanizes, and I use urbanized as a very distinct word, it doesn't mean that everybody's moving into the city. It means people are moving towards the city, meaning they could be in a suburb, they could be in an exurb. They want the advantages of being close to the metropolitan center, but not necessarily in all cases to be in the city. But nevertheless, the interesting thing about this to me is that the areas of greatest intensity are in areas that have historically not been the centers of urbanization. The Southeast, where we are, and the Western United States. So if you look at long-term trends, these are going to be the areas, in fact, the city we're sitting in today, where you're going to see so much more growth that it's going to be difficult to keep up with the infrastructure and with the needs of a growing population. Next slide. As I told you, Charlotte kind of decided how we wanted growth to happen, and so those green areas are really the more arterial areas where we wanted to have intensity, and the areas in between we called wedges, which were less intense. Our transit plans clung to those green areas, and our residential zoning largely kept to the wedge areas. Next slide. So I took a group of mayors to Amsterdam because I actually didn't know that much about Amsterdam, and I just assumed that since the Vikings, people in Amsterdam were riding bicycles. But the truth of the matter is, this is Amsterdam in the 1970s. It's a heavily automobile-centric country. This is a picture of Amsterdam today. Next slide. Where the car has been significantly de-emphasized, and people have been put at the center of their transportation strategies. And today it's not unusual to see many more bicycles in a street than cars. My point in showing you that is that this movie has been played before, and there are countries that have figured out how to make the conversion. Next. There's another dynamic to transportation today, which is how our stuff moves. And my favorite story here is over the holidays. I remember as a kid, we'd all go to the mall, to the strip mall, to the store, to wherever, and we'd get whatever we were going to get as gifts, and we'd wrap them the night before Christmas and so forth. Well, my wife has a new strategy for the 21st century, which is she gets online and she starts, dialing up everything, and I have to try to lay my body on the railroad tracks to stop some of it, but she'll turn to me inevitably and she'll say, "Look how many trips I saved." You just created 25 trips. This stuff is going to be moving from all over the place. And God knows how many miles of trips you've created. And the reality is that's a metaphor for what's happening to the things we use every day. We are in a period of time where it's ever more convenient to get stuff brought right to our doorstep, but the impact of that trip is kind of disaggregated from us. We don't know how many miles we're creating as a result of that. Next slide. That's my picture from holidays. So this is a forecast, a bit of a forecast for where the bottlenecks are in our freight system today. package that comes into the port of Los Angeles will take about 2 days to get to Chicago. That same package sometimes will take 2 days to get through the city of Chicago because of the bottlenecked rail system in Chicago. And they've got a big plan to fix that, but it's $50 billion, and there's not $50 billion sitting somewhere to pay for it. Next. This is a picture of future volumes, and the red is showing you parts of our freight network that are going to be overtaxed by the load. And so the point here is that there's a price to the convenience that we have today that we don't necessarily see. Next. We're starting to see some companies work around that. Amazon, for example, has a fleet of airplanes that now serve its delivery needs. They've literally blown through the capacity of the Postal Service, of UPS, of DHL, of FedEx. And so they're having to create their own freight system. Next. Now, I'm going to come back to this map later because y'all are MPO geeks just like me. These are the mega regions of our country. These are the centers of economic activity in our country. And one argument that I'm going to make to you is that we have a moment where we really should be working hard to align our transportation decision-making along those economic lines. They cross city barriers, they cross state barriers, and yet the organizing principle through federal policy has basically been to focus on the jurisdictional level. Now, I have to tell you, I was fortunate enough, and I'm not bragging, but I was fortunate enough to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate by 100-0, which is not easy. I'm very proud of that. However, that was not my biggest partisan victory, bipartisan victory. My biggest bipartisan victory was an effort to align our metropolitan planning decision-making along this map. We passed a rule right as we were leaving the Obama administration that would help do that. And the bill to dismantle that rule passed within 2 months. On the House side, I think there were only 3 votes against it, and then it was unanimous on the Senate side. So I have a track record of creating bipartisan cooperation. Thank you very much. Climate change. Climate change is a real thing, and it's impacting the way that we think about how to build infrastructure. Next. These weather events that we've seen, you've seen them here in this region. We've seen them in New York. We've seen them in New Orleans. We've seen them even in my home state of North Carolina. They are real things. And if we're not serious about reducing our impact on this issue, we will see more and more and more. And the cost will go up and up and up. Next. We took several steps. Even in the Sandy relief, what we did was start to think about resiliency differently. The New York subway system, for example, had its wires, electrical wires, underneath the train tracks, subway tracks, and that was ultimately a bad problem when it came to the flooding of the subway system. So now the wires are above the tracks. Many stoplights in New York, New Jersey, the New York region have been put further in the ground. They're really sort of nuts and bolts things that we've learned as a result of this, but those learnings are now being spread across other jurisdictions. One other note, the CAFE standards that we put in place were a critical component of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They're in a tenuous place today, and so I'm glad that many of you and those of us out in the private sector are raising our voices about keeping those CAFE standards in place. Technology. I won't stay on this because ultimately my argument here is that technology is neutral, and really it's up to us to make the technology work for people, not to have people working for the technology. And that work is work that cities and groups like yours are going to have to be actively involved in. I'm proudest of the Smart City Challenge we did, which really set the bar for cities to be demand setters for technology. You know, technology companies are thinking of all kinds of things they can sell to cities, but the question is, are they really useful to cities? And so the Smart City Challenge put up federal money, and it put cities in a position to define how they want the technology to come to them. So for example, next slide, the city of Columbus, which won the competition, one of the problems they had before the competition was a higher than average infant mortality rate. They wanted to try to do something about this. And they realized there were certain zip codes and certain neighborhoods where young mothers were particularly likely to have this problem. And so what they've decided to do is to create an app that will help mom create not only her doctor's appointment, but a transit trip to support her to that doctor's appointment. Sounds like a pretty good idea. But then the question became, well, what if mom doesn't have a mobile phone? And what if mom is unbanked? What if she has no credit card, no bank account? And so the decision was made to put kiosks in those areas that would allow people to make cash payments, but also would allow them to access the app even if they didn't have a phone. And so these are the types of issues that I think cities are uniquely positioned to put on the table so that the technology is available to as many people as possible. Next. I'm just showing you this because this is a flying car or whatever. Good luck with that. Next. Okay. Two last things. Decisions and dollars. This is where you all come into play. This is my favorite topic, by the way, because this one has to do with, garbage in, garbage out. If we don't organize the right way on the front end, we're not going to get the right result on the back end. Next slide. Why do we have so many potholes in the country? It's a question I always got asked. I got blamed for it. I don't know. Ask the NPO. I'm joking. Why do we have so many potholes? Why do we have so much traffic? Why do we, so many questions about this. Next slide. Well, let's look at this. Our gas tax revenues are declining. The good news is that cars are becoming more efficient. The bad news is because they're becoming more efficient, the amount of revenue is actually going down. This is a structural problem, and it won't be fixed necessarily by just raising the gas tax. It won't be fixed the right way just by indexing the gas tax. We're going to need another payment system that actually is relevant to things like electric or hydrogen-powered vehicles or what have you. Next. The other dirty little secret is that the federal government contributes a woefully small percentage to the overall dollar in transportation. So, in fact, most local governments and state governments combined contribute double or more than what the federal government does. Now, of course, the federal government dollars are oftentimes formulaic, and they're often big in terms of quantum, but the reality, and they also often direct how they are to be used, which is one of the big opportunities for transportation in the 21st century, is for the federal government to unlock how that money is used and to allow states and local governments to use it much more flexibly. You can clap if you want. I'm trying to help you out. I don't know. And then the decision making is kind of interesting. The states drive a lot of it. I was arguing, again, for much more autonomy at the MPO level in exchange for MPOs that fit the overall footprint of the economic area of significance. This is a change that I think we need to take in the future, but as you can see, we have all these inputs and they have to agree usually for something big to happen, which is one of our constraints. People tell me, well, China's got this bullet train and Japan's got this bullet train. Why don't we have a bullet train? Well, the reality is that, if the administration, Congress, the governor, the MPO, and the mayor don't agree, it's probably not going to happen. And oftentimes, elections kind of mix up that combination a lot. So even when there is agreement, sometimes it changes mid-course. And we're seeing a little bit of this with the California high-speed rail project today. Back to our mega regions. So I'm not going to beat this dead horse anymore, but I'm just going to say to you that this is our map. This is our road to victory as a country, is to align along this map and to really work aggressively to make decisions together. Next. This is our MPO map, by the way. And if you look at the previous map versus this map, you see that the decision making is sort of broken down into many units within these mega regions. Next. And again, the growth is going to be concentrated in new areas. What does this map mean for you? It means when I went to the Hill and I tried to argue for transit funding, for more transit funding, I got from southeastern United States members of Congress, the thing they said was all this money is going to go to New York, Chicago, blah, blah, blah. Well, if this map is an indication of where population is going, that money is going to be coming into Florida. It's going to be going into Georgia. It's going to be going into Southern California, into Nevada, into these states that have historically not had strong fixed rail transit systems. And so if we're looking at where the hockey puck is headed, that's where it is headed. Next. But the map doesn't look like this today. Now, this is per capita funding. So we have this upside down problem of the money from the federal government is being directed into places that are either staying static or losing population, and the population growth is in areas where there's less per capita money. By the way, the federal formula hasn't changed since 2009. I don't know if you knew that, but they haven't updated it. They've just been using the same formula since before the last census. So all this growth is not really calculated into how the formula dollars are being allocated. Okay, solutions, real quick, and I'll stop. Personal mobility. Land use is the secret weapon. You all know this. If we get that right, that will help us more than almost any other single solution. We have to do the other things, the infrastructure, the investment, so forth. But being smart on land use is a real weapon. Choices. We shouldn't all have to get in a car to get someplace. We should be creating a mix of choices so that people can make those decisions on their own based on what's happening. And frankly, it's not bad for people to have more choices than just one choice at a given time. We also need to think about how to create one-stop shopping for users, how to create systems where someone can look on a single app on their phone and be able to see all these choices in front of them in terms of travel times, cost, et cetera. And I also think cities need to be thinking about I think it's a false choice to think about like this sharing economy versus transit. I think that's a false choice. I actually think there's some creative ways that transit can benefit from this new sharing economy, and trying to figure that out, I think, is a roadmap to the future. Next. Freight, I'll just blow past because you all care about freight, but it's really the equity components here that you care about. The CAFE standards, resiliency lessons, all these things are so critically important. Let's go to the next. I think we shouldn't have irrational exuberance about technology. It's not going to solve our problems, actually. What's going to solve our problems is the public and the private sectors thinking together about how we want our society to actually evolve. And that's everything from these ethical choices that'll have to be made with autonomous vehicles to how do we actually want the urban context to be set in the future? I frankly think there are urban freeways that could be torn down and replaced with open space or affordable housing or other assets that will be more valuable and actually not have a significant impact on travel times if it's done well. And we're seeing examples of that in Syracuse, which is talking about tearing down some part of I-81. And again, I talked about Seattle as well. Next. You have a transportation bill that's going to come up in 2020, maybe 2021. And I think MPOs are uniquely suited to be a strong voice on reinventing American transportation. But you can't wait until 2020. You've got to start now, building the case for what's broken in our transportation system. And then I'll end where I started. I want to talk about public input, and then we'll stop. This is like a basic thing, but it's an example of how we need to rethink. So I was over in Copenhagen, and I met with a group called Gale Architects, and they were talking about public input from an entirely different perspective. You know, public input to me as a mayor was, we're going to have a meeting at 4 o'clock in the City Hall, room 304. Come, tell us what you think about X transportation project. Then the inputs would be taken, and then we'd move on. Well, Gale had a different idea, and I think it's a brilliant idea, and we created flexibility in federal standards to allow you to do this. But the idea was, rather than have these sort of staged public input meetings, which are sometimes of dubious importance to the final result, why not go out into communities where people are, using the language that regular people use, not transportation speak, and start talking to them about these issues in a way that allows us to get real feedback. And I'm talking about neighborhood association meetings and community meetings, coffee shops. That's an entirely different way of thinking about how to get public input. And it's something that we should really embrace as a transportation community. I dare say that if we had done that in the 1950s and 1960s. I dare say if we'd had something like the Voting Rights Act and it wasn't accepted fact that you could completely ignore certain communities, that we would have had a better system. And so again, it's on us to make sure we're hearing from all voices in the various communities. And that, I believe, is one of the big keys to creating opportunity through transportation in the 21st century. So if you don't remember anything else, the technology is neutral. Cars were new technology in 1950. Autonomous vehicles will be new technology at some point. But that technology is not going to save us. We have to save ourselves. Thank you.